If your enemy came to you, one who has mistreated you and spoken evil of you, but was going through financial difficulty and asked you for food, would you give it to him? What if they were thirsty? Would you give them a drink? What if they needed money? Would you lend it to them? Not expecting something back. Because God's Word instructs you and I to be generous, even to an enemy. Luke 6:35, and this is not the only passage that speaks about that, but Paul talks about never repay evil with evil, but overcome evil with good, as he also speaks of that, do good to your enemy, and you'll be, as he quotes from the Old Testament, that you'll be heaping coals upon their head, to sum up what he wrote. But Luke 6:35, Jesus spoke these words, "But love your enemies and do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men." Generosity. That we ought to be generous people. No matter who the person is, even as the Bible speaks of, as somebody who's an enemy. I think of a story of generosity there's a series of books that I've read to my children. We've gone through a couple times through these. These are true stories of how God has worked in people's lives and how His providence. There was a story of a sailor who was robbed, and he was passing through some towns and on his way to London, and he was asking people just to stay in the barns, or stay where they, just give me a place over my head. I'll gladly sleep in the straw. Well, some people, instead of saying no, they were mean about that. They were mean to him and get out of here. We don't want you and your kind around here. But there was a stable boy who told him, "You know what, I know of a widow who lives down here a little bit, that she always is willing to help people." And it was late at night, and he goes and finds the place and asks her if he can stay in the shed, stay in the barn here, and she gladly let him do that. She made him dinner, shared her dinner with him, and in the morning gave him breakfast and a little bit of money, even though she was poor herself, and sent him on his way. And it wasn't until 10 years later that she receives a mysterious note calling her to come to London. Well, she gets there wondering what's going on. Well, it turns out it was from that man that she helped 10 years prior. Not only was he still a sailor, he had his own ships now. And so he instructed his lawyer, is when she got there and met him where she was instructed to, that his lawyer was going, for the rest of her life, once a year, going to give her so much money. And she thanked him and said that she was going to use this to help more people, like he was helped by her. And so that's a story of generosity. That's a story of helping somebody that many others would not, who looked down upon. But as I asked earlier, what about an enemy? How far would you be going to help them? The Bible says to lend, the Bible says to give a food and drink to them. But what if they wanted you to, if somebody you didn't like, or somebody who was unkind to you, what if they wanted you to co-sign a loan for them? Is that being generous, and that is being helpful? Well, in short, no, that's not in the spirit of generosity. Because as you notice that the title of the sermon is three people or three kinds of people you should not imitate. And the first one we'll look at today is the cosigner who thinks they're being generous to people. But in reality, it's not. Proverbs 6:1 gives a warning. If you turn there, Proverbs 6:1. My son, if you have become surety for your neighbor, have given a pledge for a stranger. Here comes the warning here. Actually, verses 1 through 5 is the warning. The warning that passes about being a cosigner on a loan. Being a cosigner there. Because of what a cosigner is, and I'm sure most of you are aware of that, is that you are actually taking responsibility that if anything should ever happen, that if that person quit paying on that money, then you are saying that you'll take over for the payments. But you're really hoping that that never happens. And so there needs to be caution before doing this. Even if you know someone very well, a relative, a close friend, it's what the neighbor represents. I mean, most people are not going to, in reality, be a cosigner for a total stranger. But they will, maybe a co-worker or somebody that they know. And see this pledge, he talks about this pledge. If you become surety for your neighbor, having get a pledge for a stranger. You know, in ancient times, that when somebody get a loan, lend money, that what they would do for collateral is they would give them their outer garment. It's collateral to repay the loan. Often that would be used as a blanket to sleep and stay warm. Because the reality is that most people only had one or two changes of garments. They didn't have a closet full of blankets and coats and things like that we have today. Even the poorest of us have blankets and coats, even if they may have holes in them. The wealthiest people back then may have a few more changes of clothing back then, but nothing like we do today. And so they would give this outer garment, which essentially would be their coat, what they would use to stay warm, as a pledge. And then they would shake hands. And oftentimes, I'm sure that there would be some type of signing a legal document, whether it's a piece of paper or clay, especially depending on the size of the loan. But when someone gave their blanket, when somebody gave their outer garment, the Bible commanded Israelites to return that before sunset. Because Exodus 22, 26 through 27 says, if you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you are to return it to him before sunset. For that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his body. What else should he sleep in? And it shall come after that when he cries out to him, I will hear him, for I am gracious. And so we know in the Bible that we are to be a generous people and to help those who are in need. But however, it is not cosigning alone, is not generosity. And often those who do sign a cosign a loan for another person does so because they want to help and be generous. They want to help that person. And nowadays, it might not even have to be cosign a loan. We could add in as well putting money on a credit card for someone, hoping, and they promise, I swear I will pay you back. But oftentimes the reality is they don't. And we're left holding the bag. But we are to be generous people. God commanded generosity. He taught his people to be generous. He himself is generous, and we are to be generous. You know that in the Old Testament, one example of generosity is the forgiving of debts every 7 years. Every 7 years, debts were forgiven. The people were to still, even if there's 1 year left before I say, if somebody was to come and ask them, can I borrow some money? And there was 1 year before the 7th year, God still instructed them to trust Him and to freely lend that money to Him. Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 15. At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a remission of debts. This is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. From a foreigner you may exact it, but your hand shall release whatever of yours is with your brother. However, there will be no poor among you, since the Lord will surely bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance possess. If you only listen obediently to the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all His commandment which I am commanding you. For the Lord your God will bless you as He promised you, and you will lend to many nations, but you will not borrow. And you will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. If there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers in any of your towns in your land, which the Lord your God has given you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand from your poor brother. Verse 8, but you shall freely open your hand to him, and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need and whatever he lacks. Be aware that there's no base thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of remission is near, and your eye is hostile toward your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then he may cry to the Lord against you, and it be a sin in you. You shall generously give him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and all your undertakings. For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in the land. If your kinsman, verse 12, a Hebrew man or woman is sold to you, then he shall serve you 6 years, but in the 7th year you shall set him free. When you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flock and from your threshing floor and from your wine vat. You shall give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I commanded you this day. See, this is, I will say this is actually a picture of God's forgiveness of sin and setting people free from their slavery of sin. There was that picture here. But also there was the actuality of forgiving debt. Can you imagine today if debt was wiped out and forgiven every 7 years? I hear people, that you just totally forgive that and wipe that out. Well, that's what's going on. And that to freely let the person borrow, even though there may be 6 months, there may be 3 months left in that 6th year. God promises that He would bless His people. Then you have here what is talking about sold themselves to you, a slave in a sense, but it's really more of an indentured servant. If somebody got into poverty, they got into debt. There are times that the person would sell themselves to pay off their debt, and then they would serve that person. They were supposed to serve them for 6 years. And the Lord said, in the 7th year, you release them from their service, and then you give to them and supply food and such for them. That's what's going on. And there's actually a year of Jubilee that they were supposed to observe too. The 50th year, when property had been sold, would be also, not only would debts be forgiven, but they were to cease from work. Take that year off. That whatever grew, and they would eat off of that. That people would be released from debts would be released and forgiven. People would be released from slavery. And then as well as people who sold their properties, they would be returned back to the original owner. So it was kind of like letting somebody use your property for 49 years. That they gave you money for that and they were using it. And it goes back to the original family as going through the line there. But sadly, Israel never did. There's nothing written in the Bible that they ever observed either one of these. But they were to be generous in doing this. Another example of generosity is instructed those who harvest fields. I know I've used this example before, that from the grape fields and the vineyards and the crops, that they were to leave the corners of the fields for the poor, the widows, and even foreigners. And then also, if they dropped anything fell out that they were carrying, it fell out, they were to leave that. That's where you find Ruth in the Old Testament, that she's out gleaning. And in fact, that you have this man, that Boaz was generous. Not only was it that they purposely would drop stuff for her. And so in Leviticus 23:22 is one of those scriptures that talk about that. When you reap the harvest of your land, moreover, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor gather the gleaning of your harvest. You are to leave them for the needy and the alien. I am the Lord your God. So the needy, the poor, the widows, the foreigners that have traveled there, that they were to help them. They weren't to make sure they got every last piece of wheat or barley or grapes. We do have the scriptures. I just mentioned Boaz is one of the ones that did observe that, and there were others as well, because that practice was going on, and Naomi knew about it. God instructed His people to be generous and loan money without interest with fellow Israelites. It was okay to charge an interest rate to foreigners, but it had to be a fair interest rate. It could not be taking advantage of somebody, having high interest rates. You could not be a loan shark to a foreigner. You could not be like these payday loans where you charge exorbitant interest rates to people. And if they would obey God, God would bless them, and they had to trust Him that they would have gotten more back than they would ever got back in interest rate. Because that's what God says, Exodus 22, 25, and 26. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you return it to him before the sun sets. And the New Testament actually takes that even further, in a way. Luke 6:35. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you'll be sons of the Most High, for He Himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men. Expecting nothing in return. Expecting whether that be as the return to favor, could be as well as that here is, if they pay me back, they pay me back. And if they don't, it's a gift. In the New Testament, we're told to be generous, cheerful, and give sacrificial. This doesn't, I want you to know these principles I've used for giving to the church, when we give to the Lord, but actually it applies to giving to others as well. The context of this passage from 2 Corinthians is an offering being collected for the poor in Jerusalem. We are to give cheerfully, for each one must do, 2 Corinthians 9:7, each one must do as he's purposed in his heart, not grudgingly, under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So that would apply whether we're giving to people or giving to the Lord at church, or sending money to missionaries, or where it may be. Generously is a second principle. 2 Corinthians 9:6, now this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, but he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. You know, I believe that God does provide. When we're generous, He is generous with us. I'm not saying we should never go out like some will say, hey, if you give to God, He's going to give you tenfold. He's going to give 100-fold to you. That's what we say. It's just that God provides in different ways when we're generous. Third, sacrificially. For I testify that according to their ability, 2 Corinthians 8, 3 and 4, to their ability, beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging us with much urging for the favor of participation and the support of the saints. These people were, as I've said before in past sermons, there was two words for poverty. There was those who would daily beg. There were the day workers, what they earned for that day would provide for their needs. So they worked day by day, and they would get paid each day, doing different jobs. And so they would get what they provided. That is poverty. But this word is used for begging poor. Somebody that may be blind, as we see a blind Bartimaeus who was on the roadside begging for alms. Somebody that may be lame. Somebody that here they're not able to work some way. Here they're actually, and they're out of their poverty, this church was giving to help those who were poor as well. Fourth, we give according to what you have, not what according to you hope to have. 2 Corinthians 8, 11 through 12, but now finish doing it also, so that just as there was a readiness to desire it, so there may be also the completion of your ability. For if the readiness is present, it is acceptable according to what a person has done, not according to what he does not have. So we give out of what we have and what we can. And so we need to take caution when it comes to... These are all examples of generosity. And notice, none of them ever state being a co-signer. Because understand that you take on the responsibility of another person's debt. Co-signing is really, in a sense, gambling because you're risking the future. You're hoping that that person keeps their promises. You're hoping that person continues making the payments. You're hoping that person is not late, and that they're racking up penalties and interest, which you may become responsibility for. And so you must be careful, much caution. Proverbs 6 is not the only passage in Scripture that warns about co-signing. There are many others. Proverbs 11:15, he who is a guarantee for a stranger will surely suffer it, but he who hates being a guarantor is secure. A co-signer is what that is. Proverbs 17:18, a man lacking the sense pledges and becomes a guarantor in the presence of his neighbor. You know, the world actually, these are times that, we've talked about, there's often times when the wisdom of the world is in conflict with the wisdom of God. But this is one of these areas that they actually, much of what the world says, they agree with what Scripture says. Our own government warns against that. Federal Trade Commission. You find this statement on their website. Though when they talk about being a co-signer, you are being asked to guarantee this debt. Think carefully before you do. If the borrower does not pay the debt, you will have to. Be sure you can afford to pay if you have to, and that you want to accept this responsibility. You may have to pay up to the full amount of the debt if the borrower does not pay. You may also have to pay late fees or collection costs, which increase this amount. The creditor also can collect this debt from you without first trying to collect from the borrower. And they put a little asterisk there, depending on the laws in your state, this may not apply. If state law forbids a creditor from collecting from a co-signer without first trying to collect from the primary debtor. The creditor can use the same collection methods against you that can be used against the borrower, including suing you or garnishing your wages. If this debt is ever in default, this fact may become a part of your credit record. And this notice is not the contract that makes you liable for the debt, is what they finish up with. And so think about that there are reasons that banks will not loan to that person because they're risky. And even credit cards there. If you do co-sign a loan, you're going to be putting your family at risk. You're going to be putting your future at risk. There's many stories I found on the internet about problems that people had when they co-signed a loan for someone, not thinking things through. And these weren't stories of these weren't stories of strangers. This was somebody a neighbor of theirs for a long time. This was a friend that there was like a brother or sister to them, and it turned to a nightmare. One person told a story of their mother-in-law who they would just pay every month that they would pay the day before, it would be 30 days late. They would pay that. Even though it wouldn't show up on their credit report against them being 30 days late, they would pay just the day before. And that person would get harassed each month from letting them know that this person hasn't paid yet. They haven't paid this. And so, you must be careful. A pastor by the name of Raymond Ortland Jr. writes this about one of his friends' experiences being a co-signer for a business loan. He writes this: a friend of mine made this mistake. He was at home one day when a man came to ask him to co-sign a loan for $250,000. The bank wanted more security. My friend thought, he's a good guy. I care about him. I don't want to disappoint him, and he signed it. He knew Proverbs 6, but the moment he forgot it. Then the man went belly up, and the bank came after my friend. He lost about $100,000 in cash, and the bank did not let up on him until he begged them not to throw his wife out of their house. He had jeopardized his wife's future. He repented before God, and over the next 10 years, God graciously restored the lost money. It was pure grace. And there's a reason why I also said about credit cards as well. Putting money on your credit card is going to be a type of co-signing that you say, you know what, I'll go ahead and put stuff on my credit card. Well, I've experienced I've experienced that, and that was a stupid, foolish mistake and a learning experience that I did. That I had a guy that you never should work for for someone who was struggling financially. But I was working construction with them, and I wanted to get paid, and he needed to buy. He ran out of money to buy the materials. And I thought, hey, I'll go ahead and put that on my credit card. Well, not only did I not get paid for the work I did, never got paid for that there. And so that was a learning experience. That was probably, I don't remember, I think it was between $300 and $500, which was, they promised me that they would give that money to me, and they never did. And so that was a learning experience. And that was money that I could not afford to do. And so you may be wondering, with all this warnings, and is it always wrong? You may be asking yourself, is it always wrong, unwise, always sin to be a co-signer? Not in every situation, no. It's kind of hard to come down. The Bible warns against that. I mean, there's no doubt about that. God advised against that. There may be some situations that, considering that you can, or want to, I should say, but it doesn't mean it's not risky and it's not dangerous. And we know that, again, Proverbs 11:15, he who is a guarantee for a stranger will surely suffer for it, but he who hates being a guarantor is secure. Proverbs 22:26-27, do not be among those who give pledges, among those who become guarantors for debt. If you have nothing with which to pay, why should he take your bed from under you? That's a pretty graphic, that's a pretty eye-opening illustration here. They take your bed from underneath you. GotQuestions.org speaks about this. To put up security for a stranger is a most dangerous thing, as thousands have learned to their sorrow. Many a man will do this for a friend long known and trusted, but no wise man will act for a stranger. Often parents will sign notes or loans with their children. There's a principle seen in these biblical words of wisdom. No one should co-sign or guarantee with another on any amount which possibly could fall back upon them and become their responsibility to pay. Now, whether or not it's wise or safe to co-sign a loan for a relative or a trusted friend is difficult to say. We can say as well as a child, even a grown-up child, son and daughter. It's difficult to say. Much depends on the circumstances. One needs to be discerning, commit the situation to prayer, follow the Lord's leading where known and trusted people are involved, and one must be able to pay should it ever become necessary. But this is definitely not something to do for strangers and those barely known to us. And even it's risky with with people that are close to us. And so we always have to take a case-by-case type of situation. Because even the world warns about that. Things to consider is that you should look, some of the things I saw is that you should ask for that person's credit report to see what I don't know if that varies by state, but if this person is asking you to do a co-sign a loan, they say ask for their credit report. Ask for as well that when you sit down for this, you ask the person that's doing the institution, that's or the bank, or whoever's doing the loan, you look at it and see if they're using not only your credit score, but also your finances as far as the amount you make. They said that is a very large warning flag. You should never do if they are using the amount of not just your credit score, but also your finances there, because that's a huge warning flag, a red flag. And so we got to remember that there's many other ways to help a person. Because if we have the money, we can loan it to them interest-free. We could, if we want to be really generous, we can loan them that money. But only loaning what will not hurt you financially. And so there's always caution. And so if you ever approach that situation, or if somebody asks you, should I do this? You can go to God's Word and go to these things and show them, these are things you want to consider before doing this. Because we probably know people, you probably either yourself have been co-signed and it came back on you, or you know somebody that it came back on. And so we always want to be wise. And if we ever do, we want to be very cautious. Look at verse 2 with me to continue this graphic illustration. Well, if you've been snared with the words of your mouth, have been caught with the words of your mouth, this is doing something you may regret. This is why verse 2 gives this picture of what happens. Been like a bird snared in a trap. It's caught. It can't go anywhere now. If that's a live trap, or a trap that we often seen in movies and cartoons that range from small ones for rabbits and birds, all the way up to big ones for bear that cling shut on the leg. That is a picture that goes along with this as well. That we're caught by our words. Because we said we're trapped, but it's not that you will get trapped, you are trapped. You caught with your words saying, yes, I will do this. Caught with as well as saying, now today, because it's guaranteed when we not only have said, but now as we sign our name. Our pens have caught us. Our hands. You're going to have an albatross around your neck. You're going to be carrying King Kong on your back because it'll be a burden. Because they're promising that they swear up and down to you that they will pay back. And you're promising the lender that you guarantee that if that person defaults, I will pay. And you're assuming that things will never change, that they won't lose their job, that they're going to make payments on time, that they're telling even the truth. And they don't have any attention. Because some people, they'll do that to people, co-sign a loan, have somebody co-sign a loan, deceive them, and then never make payments. Not one single payment. And it comes back a haunt. One of the other stories I read about was this lady telling about her uncle who did a car loan for his neighbor. Well, the neighbor was late, found out that she didn't carry insurance, so he had to actually pay the penalties for not having insurance on the car because the dealership ended up putting the car in his name as well, that they were co-owners. And so he was responsible for the insurance. And so he had to pay these penalties. And so that's why there's much warning. There's a lot of risk. Look at verse 3 with me. Do this then, my son, because he says, if you're caught, do this, my son, to deliver yourself, since you have come into the hand of your neighbor. Go humble yourself and inopportune your neighbor. Bible, Solomon says, go and beg the person to take you off as a cosigner. Beg the lender to take off the loan there. Get out of that deal. Deliver yourself out. And just as they could get out of it back then, there's some ways that you can get out today. It just depends if it's written in the contract. Because they're not going to, in most cases, want to do that. But there are ways that can be. But you're going to have to do research. And you're at that person's you're at that person's mercy until they pay that off. I mean, those stories again that I read, talk about getting calls, monthly calls, letters, harassment from getting called because that person would be late, racking up late fees and interest, what you become responsible for. So it may take many times to say, that's why it says to humble yourself and inopportune yourself, which means to bother them, the creditor, until they take you out of that. Wear them out until you're released from that. Just like the woman in Jesus' parable about the unjust judge, that she kept on asking for, she wanted legal help, and he finally gave in. You may have to pester the creditors to get out of that. It may be humiliating, but it's better to get that out than to have the stress of the length of loan. And better to have to, and it's better than to have to pay when they don't, because that can happen. Car loans are typically 5 to 6 years. Some are shorter, some are longer. Homes are typically 30 years. Sometimes home loans can be up to 50 years, depending on somebody's credit, all the way down to 15 or 10. But most likely you wouldn't be a cosign loan for somebody that's 10 years because they have good credit, 15 years. So you're talking about a long time. Give no sleep to your eyes or slumber to your eyelids is what verse 4 declares. Continue the exhortation to get out from that. Not only humble yourself, but not resting until you do that. Doing your research. Even though sleep is very important, this is more important. Picture of being diligent and not resting until you're free. Because it actually can impact your credit. It actually can cause you, if you wanted to get a car loan or a home loan, that they look at that person, that they look at it as, since you co-signed, it's now on your credit report, and that it actually counts against your debt to credit ratio. And so you can be denied for a loan. And people have had that happen to them. The person swore up and down that, I only have you on here for a year. I'll only have you on here for a year or two. Nah, that didn't happen. It took years to actually get that changed. Proverbs 6:5, deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hunter's hand, like a bird from the hand of the fowler. An animal, when it's cornered, is going to try to get out of that predicament every way it can. It's going to fight. It's going to focus all its energy on doing so. And that's what the picture is here. An animal that That here they're doing everything they can to get out of that. And so we don't rest until we're released. Or, so the Bible gives very much a warning. Very much there's a lot of dangers in that. And so we must be careful. There's certain circumstances that we may want to, especially when it's your own child or your brother, your sister. And so, but you still need to consider those things and consider what type of person they are. Have they been responsible, or have they been careless? Because it is hard to say no to them. But those are things to consider. That would I be able to pay for this when I do this? I want to help my family member, but am I going to be able? Is this going to hurt me in the long run? Am I able to do this, or is it going to cause me to go into greater debt? And so we got to be careful. And then also that we need to we ought to be generous in many ways and help people. To pray for them, and if we have the resources to help and provide for them. And so we can be generous, as the Bible talks about being generous, that we can give money to people, and if they pay us back, they do. And if they don't, then it is a gift. And so we can be generous to people. And then also, that if you're not affected directly by this, as I mentioned earlier, that somebody ever comes to you and says, what do you advise? You'd be able to go to the Scriptures and say, there's a lot you need to think about before you do this. That you need to really do due diligence and your homework there before you get caught in that. And then if you're in this type of situation, ask God's help to get you out. That you go to God, and then you pray and ask for His help. But that means also you go to the creditors and say, please, is there any way I can get out of this there? And so we ask for the Lord's help. And so we want to be wise. And so this is why we want to imitate God, for He is generous. We want to imitate those we've seen who are wise and generous. But we want to be careful. And so we don't want to entrap ourselves. And so we have to be careful.